Hi, welcome to the Dieku podcast. I'm Gary Snow. I am joined today by Shannon Appelcline once again for the year in review. And Shannon is the author of Designers and Dragons, and you can get all four, at least digitally. I don't know if you can get them still in print, but we'll talk about that shortly. And that shares the history of role-playing games, and it's a must-read if you're a role-playing game fan. And he is now the author of This is Free Trader Beowulf, which we'll also be talking about. And Shannon is going to bring his knowledge and experience on the history of role-playing games to provide context to the historical events of this year. So Shannon, welcome.
Thank you very much. Great to be here, Gary.
Well, it's always, I enjoy it every single year. I'm very grateful that you come on and you impart your wisdom to us. For those that are maybe new to the role-playing game world and they don't have that context of, hey, what's happening this year? Is it similar to years past? So it's always exciting to learn from you, and I really appreciate that. But before we get started, let's talk about what you've been up to since we had you on last year.
Yeah, actually 5 years now. I've been working on kind of the same thing, which is getting more Designers and Dragons books into print. Getting close to the end of some of those projects. I've got almost 10 books in process. This is Free Trader Beowulf was the first one to come out, and that was history all about a history all about the Traveler role-playing game, all the way back from when GDW put it out in 1977 to the present day.
I'll give you a chance to clear your throat as I will talk about the fact that the name of This is Free Trader Beowulf, for those, I always get the Beowulf tripped up on, but anyways, for those that are unaware, the opening box that you can read here, it actually is a mayday from Free Trader Beowulf. So great name for the book, and you can see it on the shelf behind Shannon there, actual print copy. And so tell us a little bit about your experience bringing that to life.
So my experience with Traveler goes back to the 80s. It was one of the first role-playing games that I ever got. One of my aunts kind of cold sent me a copy of it for a Christmas gift, knowing that I was interested in role-playing, and it was terrific. I loved rolling all of the random tables. I loved making characters. I loved making star systems. Mark Miller's talked a lot about how the solo gameplay of Traveler was one of the things he thought was a big innovation, and I definitely agree with that. So I've run a couple of campaigns. My most recent was before I moved out here to Hawaii in the Tins in the Bay Area, and I ran using Mongooses system. So I've stayed in love with it. I've written, even before this, long sets of reviews talking about the fiction of the world, both what's influenced it and the fiction that it created. And so 2022 probably, I got an email from Mongoose saying, hey, would you be interested in doing a history book? Because the first edition of Designers and Dragons actually came out from Mongoose before I published it in the second edition with Evil Hat. So they knew about my work on history. And Mark Miller had worked with me to put together a lot of my reviews on the fiction into a little book that's available for PDF and pod called The Science Fiction and Traveler. So all these kind of came together, and they said, would you like to do a history of Traveler? And I said, I have absolutely no time in my schedule. I'm doing technical writing 2 to 3 days a week. I am working on the next edition of Designers and Dragons. I'm also working on putting all of these product histories that I wrote for D&D classics into books. I have no time. So yes, of course, I would be happy to.
I have no time, but yes.
Yeah. So I spent about a year and a half on it. I spent the first 6 months or so on it, just looking for articles, interviews, discussions, reviews, all of that. And after I'd done about 6 months of that, I said, I need to actually start writing. And so started writing throughout the course of the year. I continued reviewing content. I was able to go through a lot of content that I'd never seen before, like all of the fanzines put out by HIWG, which is the History of the Imperium Working Group, which was a very crucial fan organization in the 90s that kind of helped advance the setting and the history in a time that GDW was wavering a little bit on being able to support it. And so over the course of producing the book, I not only produced the book, which is a full-length book, but I also indexed and wrote histories for about 200 issues of Traveler magazines, which are all available at urzo.org, which is my website, and got a lot of really good history of Traveler. But I think the most important thing for me personally was I really enjoyed it. It was just so great to re-immerse myself in this, dense world that Mark Miller and so many other people have created over decades at this point. And it brought me back to these campaigns I've loved, to these game systems that I'd loved. And so it was a lot of fun. And when you're doing something creative and it's a lot of fun, I think the results are really good too. And so I think the book came out really well too. And it's gotten some good reviews so far.
I should mention that I've had an interview with Mark Miller, and I'll put the link up above and below. And I will also put a link to where you can buy the Free Trader Beowulf history book. And was there any surprises that kind of came out of the whole process that you were like, I had no idea about this, but like it was such a pleasant surprise?
I don't think there were surprises. I think there were revelations, which is to say, there were areas of the history that I knew I didn't know. HIWG was one of them. The whole fanzine area was another. In fact, if there was a surprise in writing the history, it might be how prolific the fanzines were. There are 30, 40, somewhere around there, different fanzines dating back to the very first ones that appeared in England in early 80s, I think, up to digital ones today, some of which are running to 100 issues or more. And so that was kind of a surprise. But mostly it was just filling in what were all these fan organizations doing, and also what happened during what I called the long night, which was the time after GDW and then Imperium Games stopped publishing and before Mongoose Publishing started publishing. And there were several different companies that were all doing content for Traveler, and they all disappeared when Mongoose appeared, but they were really scattered. A lot of them were electronic only, and so their history was getting lost very quickly. And so that was the other area where I didn't know a lot and was really able to fill in who these companies were, who the principals were, and what they did that was important for the ongoing line.
Cool. I don't know if you can hear my neighbor's car alarm going off, but I'll power through. That's good. But I'll power through, and we can probably maybe jump into the actual year in review. And it's kind of ironic that you did this like historical review of Traveler, which is like, I think, one of the pillars of like tabletop role-playing games in the sci-fi area. And obviously Dungeons and Dragons, the granddaddy of them all, it celebrated its 50th anniversary. How did that go?
Mixed, I'd say. Timothy Brannon put out an article a few days ago on his Other Side blog, and he said that it was underwhelming. And I think that's a pretty good description. I would say that there were pretty much two tentpoles from Wizards of the Coast for, celebrating the 50th. One of them was their new 2024 edition of Dungeons and Dragons, which I think rightly has gotten some acclaim as a very nice revision of the 5th edition rules that have been very well received for quite a few years now. A lot of their initial marketing and publicity had me very excited about wanting to get copies. I'm not playing a D&D game right now, and I haven't for several years. And the other tentpole was their making of original Dungeons and Dragons game. A book, which is a really impressive tome. I actually got a copy of it right here. Oh, and it's so heavy. You can see how thick it is. Mm-hmm. It's got all of these beautiful bookmarks throughout it. It's got colored pages to show you where the different things are. And it's a thick book. And that's because it goes all the way back to Dave Arneson's work on Blackmore, and prints often for the first time some of his initial discussions, reports, and stuff from his own little zine that he was putting out. and then also continues through with a 1973 manuscript that's never been published before, a lot of letters that went back and forth, and then also contained, just in case you want them, actual OD&D and the 4 main supplements for it. So it's a great tome, and it's got commentary by John Peterson in it, so it's a really nice other one. But the reason things were underwhelming, I think, for a lot of people was, well, first of all, that was it. There just wasn't a bigger celebration. And second of all, the 2024 edition is not all the way out yet. They have the new Player's Handbook and they have the new Dungeon Master's Guide, but the Monster Manual isn't coming out till next year. And in fact, by the time it's come out, since D&D was published early in the year originally, it's going to be past the 51st anniversary. And the other thing is that the OD&D book raised a lot of controversy. And it's kind of really sad that it did, because it's like one paragraph in the forward to the book that talks about the fact that the original books had some things that were sexist in them. They had some discussions of slavery or uses of slavery that people feel like aren't maybe appropriate in the modern context, a few other things like that, all in one paragraph. And this got blown up into the culture wars. And so Elon Musk was throwing a little fits on Twitter about how Wizards of the Coast should burn in hell, because this had gone through the right-wing echo chamber so much that even he'd heard about it. And the fact that single paragraph overshadowed what's a really great work of scholarship and a really great look that most people have never seen on some really early materials is a shame. But kind of along with the fact that the new edition isn't out until 2025 in its completion, it just kind of showed how Wizards of the Coast maybe wasn't paying a lot of attention, wasn't keeping their eye on the ball a lot. And I think that's in large part because they're focused as much or probably more on digital than tabletop nowadays.
Yeah, and that brings me to my next question of like, between the OGL fiasco and how much did that derail them from like kind of advancing it? And like you mentioned, the focus on digital, and maybe you can just talk about like those two in partnership.
Sure. It's hard to say. I'm not convinced the OGL fiasco had a lot of impact within Wizards after they backed off and decided to just dump things into Creative Commons. Maybe it did, but I don't think it had a lot of impact. It certainly was threatening their D&D Beyond digital work, because there was a boycott that was kicking off, and that probably was one of the things that really made them step back and say, oh, we might make more money off of licensing if we do manage to scrap the OGL, but we're going to potentially lose money on the digital field that we are saying is the way forward. So the digital, again, as with everything at Wizards of the Coast, I feel like it falls somewhere between mixed and very controversial. So one of the things that I thought was very striking was that you go and you try and buy a pre-order copy of D&D, and what were available were either digital copies or bundles with digital copies and the physical book. I mean, obviously you could go and you could just get the physical book probably on pre-order from Amazon or any other places, but that's what Wizards of the Coast is selling. And that really says to me, we're digital first, which is not what I want to see for tabletop games. You know, if I want to go digital first, Baldur's Gate 3 is still out there, and other things that were actually built for that medium, as opposed to trying to co-opt this game medium where we actually get together with friends around a table, share Cheetos, share Mountain Dews, and enjoy talking in person. Which isn't to say that digital gaming can't be great. I mean, I am 2,000 miles from my old gaming group. We are talking about, hey, maybe doing a digital role-playing game. And I know there's lots of other people from our generations who are in that same place are, even who are immune compromised and thus are afraid to get together with people, rightfully so, because of COVID. But pushing D&D to be digital first rather than digital adjacent feels problematic to me. And I think it's especially problematic because of the fact that Wizards of the Coast seems so profit driven. I think Hasbro seems so profit driven that they don't put their customers first. Not that this isn't a problem in corporate America everywhere right now, but that they put their monies first. And so D&D Beyond is out there, and it's been having controversies all year related to the rollout of 2024E. And the first one was, hey, we used to offer things a la carte, so you could just go and buy this feat that you needed for your character. Not that I'm sure microtransactions was really the way to go, but people were using it, and they really enjoyed being able to run their character on D&D Beyond and just being able to pay, $2 for this feat or $2 for this character class or whatever. And Wizards of the Coast took that away mid-year before the rollout of 2024E and said, if you want to buy content on D&D Beyond, it is by the book. And so, you have to go out and buy the entire Player's Handbook, Fighter's Handbook, whatever they come out with in the next years. You can't just buy this one feat that you use. It's a big price difference. And then later in the year, they said, oh, and by the way, we're dumping all of the 2014 content from our character creator. And that one got so much flack that they also have rolled that back, so that apparently you can. But I mean, I live in the digital ecosystem. I'm a technical writer, besides my history writing for role-playing. So I have worried for a long time about the problems of digital products, digital assets in general. And that's that they are not just ephemeral, but you don't have the same control and ownership over them. I used to work for a company called Bitmark, who was working explicitly on trying to have means to permanently mark your ownership of digital assets. And that was very important for me because I want to be able to have a PDF, and if I decide I don't want to sell it to someone. Under the first sales doctrine in the United States, that should be possible. But you can't without some type of mark of ownership, because then it's just, how do we know you're not selling a copy, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel like a lot of these are going to come together in the digital ecosystem as things like Beyond grow in power. And one of the grave problems there is someone who owns the virtual tabletop just says, I'm going to delete this content and you no longer can ever get to it again. So I felt like it should have been a really big wake-up call about our problems with ownership in the digital sphere, but we just have so little power there that there's not a lot we can do.
And I mean, despite all these, like, the delays, the OGL fiasco, and like all these kind of backlashes, they still continue to be like quite popular. Do you just attribute that to the fact that like players don't know any better and D&D is Kleenex?
D&D has always had the first mover advantage, and D&D has always had the branding advantage. I agree that the 2024E seems to have done very well. They've said that it sold more copies in the first couple of months than something else ever. It's always hard to see exactly what they're saying, but they've certainly assertively and believably said it's very successful. And the others aren't. I mean, Pathfinder for a number of years was a clear number two, but they were a clear number two, and there was a huge gap between number one, and that's always been the case. I've written more than once that maybe twice in the life of the industry, another game has gone above D&D. And one of those cases was maybe the World of Darkness did in 1997, when TSR was going out of business and so not producing products. And the other was in at the end of the 4E era, so early 2010s, when 4E had proven less successful than Wizards wanted it to be, And so they took it out of production. And again, they weren't producing products. And so Pathfinder, maybe there's more controversy on this one, did better than D&D at some points when it wasn't being printed. But yeah, I mean, D&D's always been the winner, pretty much since it started going up exponentially right when James Dallas Egbert disappeared into the steam tunnels, and it got all kinds of publicity, and nothing else has been able to stand up since. And I don't think anything is ever likely to unless Hasbro takes it out of print.
And Larian, who created Baldur's Gate, they said, okay, we're done with that. But it's kind of ironic, like you were saying, that like the online digital world, like that actually kind of scratches that itch for a lot of people. So the whole D&D Beyond and moving digital, like would they have been better off to just go to Larry and, hey, just give us what you got and we'll like take it from here?
Maybe they did. I mean, I don't know what their licensing was, but maybe. I mean, Baldur's Gate 3 was a huge surprise hit. Anything built on that chassis, I think, would be somewhat successful. The biggest thing is that I think one of the big successes of Baldur's Gate 3 was the storytelling. And so they don't have the designers and developers who put together the game. They might not do better than just very successful.
And then compounding the whole digital part of it, AI seems to be always at the forefront of like they're hiring people in AI. It seems like that is a way that they're trying to move it forward. Do you have any sense on how that's going to look in the future?
Well, they have said that they are going to use it kind of on the back end to help do some of their foundational work, which I am not convinced actually is how creative work works. But that's how that's what Chris Cox, who's the Hasbro CEO, has said. They've suggested they're going to use it to help introductory methods for getting people into the game. They've suggested that maybe they're going to use it to create adventures, maybe just online adventures. Who knows? I mean, I personally find AI deeply, deeply problematic. One of the big things is none of it's AI. I mean, that's probably the biggest thing. The LLMs, which have become so popular and recent years, they're basically pattern matchers. They're very, very, very good pattern matchers, and they look at words, contents, books, and they figure out how they're put together, and then they put other things together in kind of similar ways with the rules and processes that they've learned, and they don't know what they're actually creating. They just know they're doing things that fulfill these patterns. They seem to work a little better maybe on some of the summarization work and such, but again, they don't know what they're doing. They're just, putting things together programmatically. It's like the guy who just won Scrabble in France, Spain, I think maybe he's won them in both, without knowing the language. He just memorized the dictionary and put down those words and won the Scrabble championship. That's kind of what the LLMs do. And so I think they're very deeply problematic in that their lack of understanding, I think most people who use them don't understand their lack of understanding, and so they kind of take things at face value. But I mean, I also think they regurgitate things that are, deeply uncreative in many ways. And, maybe it's great that, it pumps out a list of 20 story ideas and you dig through all the sewage and you get the, couple of gems in there, which are genuinely gems because, it pulled some idea from something it read some time ago and knocked it out. There has certainly been a lot of pushback against Wizards saying that they are going to use it, and there is pushback every time it comes up. And part of that is because they have very clearly said we are not going to be using it for writing or for art. And then up to at least this January, they kept getting caught using it mostly in art. I haven't heard of an incident since their last AI-generated ad, which I think they finally admit was AI in January. But it's very troublesome. That doesn't even get into the question of it scraping content from creators, which I, like many people, consider theft. Wizards of the Coast can clearly use their own content to do that, but I'm not interested in them doing so and replacing their designers with regurgitated copies of what those designers wrote.
And speaking of art, I can't help but I want to ask you, like, when you think about the early days, TSR days of Dungeons and Dragons to now, and all the changes in the artwork over time, it kind of like I think in 5e it was very kind of heroic and that kind of stuff, and now it kind of seems like almost more like abstracty watercolory kind of thing. And then you go back to Russ Nicholson, who he lost last year, and like kind of like super textured kind of like graininess. Where do you think things are either heading, or do they need to revisit their past? Like, to me, on their 50th anniversary, it might have been fun to like go back a little bit to their roots. And that's where the OSR is sitting, Old School Revival, for those that don't know that one. What's your kind of thoughts on where the art and the vibes of the games are going?
It's always looked to me like two things have been going on with art. First, you hit Wizards of the Coast first edition in 2000, and they certainly seemed to say, we want to make a much more heroic game. AD&D before 2000, it really was a zero to hero game where people started off afraid their magic users were going to be killed by the rats in room 3, and they had a dagger that did d4 damage. And, it was about bringing that person up to some level of power. And starting with D&D 3 in 2000, they really pushed to, no, these guys are heroes from the start. And that was reflected, I think, strongly in the art. As you said, more heroic in 5e, but that really went all the way back to 3e, that you suddenly had these superhuman, super heroic characters. And it's all there in the artwork. And Pathfinder 2, you could see, was influenced in the same way. I think the other thing that's been happening in the art is that they have felt a need to distinguish each edition so that you could look at artwork and say, this is the style of that edition. And so 3Es looked very different, 4Es looked very different, 5Es looked very different. That kind of looks a little bit like 3E. And 5E, 2024E, whatever we end up calling it. As you say, it has this more abstract watercolor. I find a lot of the work very beautiful. Whether it's D&D or not is certainly another question. I don't feel like there's really a real means or thrust behind it, other than the fact that they're saying, we want to do something different. What's a style we could do this time? And they're playing with that for the newest edition. Yeah, I mean, I think we probably love a lot of the artwork from the 80s, probably, because that's what we remember. That's what influenced us. That's what, has that nostalgic value to us. And I think that's true with people in the OSR too, which is why we're seeing new iterations of a lot of that same work, new iterations of the same style, I should say. But I also think if you, look back and say, which artwork is truly iconic, which artwork defines the game, maybe it's just my nostalgia, but I feel like that's the artwork from the 80s, maybe into the 90s, but mostly the 80s. I feel like, if you ask someone, hey, show us the top picture, the most iconic picture from 3rd edition or 4th edition, I think they'd be hard set to just come up with one now that it's some years removed, a decade removed for even for 4E. Whereas I think 1st edition basic D&D, that people could just instantly say, I remember Legends and Lore with, the 2 people fighting and kind of their iconic gods overhead. I remember, the last Paladin in Hell from Dungeon Master's Guide. I remember that piece with the horsemen riding down the road and the people scattering before him. Those were all strong, iconic pieces, and I'm not convinced there's stuff that people would point to it the same. And I think one of the reasons you can see that is if you look at 4E, I think some of the most iconic pieces there were reimaginations, are at least pieces that were inspired by stuff from the first edition.
Okay, so enough about Wizards of the Coast and D&D. kind of, because they're like the elephant in bed. When they roll over, lots of the bed moves. But let's get into the fact that with the absence of 5.5 or 2024E or whatever the hell they're going to call it, there was a vacuum. And it seems to me that Shadow Dark was at the right place at the right time for a lot of success.
Yeah, I think Kelsey Dion got really lucky. She was doing, first of all, I should say, I've recently written a history for the next edition of Designers and Dragons, and I was really astounded by what a awesome business person she seems to be. Every time she's done new innovations, new work in the field, she's done beforehand mailing list, discussions, free products, and other things to get going. So Shadow Dark, it isn't just that it was in the right place at the right time, though it totally was, but it's that she did a lot of hard work, and she also produced a product that people were very excited and interested in. But from what she said in interviews, she was in January 2023 sitting in her chair, paging through a preprint copy that she'd made of Shadow Dark, and she looked up, and Wizards of the Coast was announcing that they were destroying the OGL. And she literally had the book done. She easily could have sent it to a press start or Kickstarter or whatever the next day. Instead, she had a couple of months of talking to lawyers, figuring out if things had to be removed, and a couple of weeks, I guess. It was not that long, though it seems forever now. And eventually she said the game was better for it because it helped her decide what did not need to cleave as close to the original D&D. It's what I call a new old school game, which is that, yes, it's old school, but it isn't a retro clone. It is interested in looking in new ways to do things too, and kind of reinventing the field based upon some foundational stuff. But long story short, she figured out how to revise it. She did some of the revisions. She didn't do some of the revisions because they were no longer necessary. And then she put out her Kickstarter, I think it was 2 months after the OGL fiasco. That was in January 2023. I think her Kickstarter was in March. And so she raised $1.3 million as a result, because it was the right place, right time. And then she actually got it out by the end of the year. It's been out for almost a year now. And so she was the first one to really get that additional impact.
And she cleaned up at the Ennies, won a lot of awards. So, congrats to her. There's other competitors, though, in the space, after the OGL, and I think everybody kind of saw what I'd like to say the gold rush. They saw Shadow Dark doing well, and they also were like, oh, how can I don't, maybe I'm, maybe I'm, what do you call it? Jaded by the business side of things, but so Tales of Valiant from Cobalt Press, they also put out their game as a competitor. How do you think, I'll run through some of these, but how do you think Tales of Valiant did in their efforts?
Well, Tales of the Valiant, I think that they were Tales of the Valiant, definitely they were designing before the OGL fiasco. I think they started talking about it right away, well before Shadow Dark's Kickstarter. Because I think they were talking about it during that 2-week period where Wizards of the Coast was getting beaten up for their decision before they decided to retract it. They did well again. It was another of the $1 million+ Kickstarters of that year, which we've had, between half a dozen and a dozen every year since COVID. But it's actually out. Of the various ones that kind of went to be D&D replacements, it's the one that managed to get to press again, I think because they had a little bit of a lead start, not as much as Shadow Dark, but some. But how much have you heard about it this year since it's been out? They've done 2 more Kickstarters, one for a GM's book, one for an adventure book. I was looking at it a little bit a few days ago, and there's not even a huge number of reviews of it. I mean, I would have expected there to be huge acclaim, notice, attention based on the attention they were getting at the start of 2023, but it came out. I mean, Kobold Press, I think, is one of the people in the FRPG space who are doing the best adventures, the best creative world building. They really have a great reputation for creating quality content. And so their new Kickstarters, they've done okay. One did almost 500,000, one did about a third of a million. But I think that's mostly based upon just the strength of the brand that's been created. I don't think people are that interested anymore in, another FRPG. And I don't think that any of the new FRPGs have really differentiated themselves strongly enough from D&D. And I think Pathfinder could get away with that when their whole selling point was, we're the D&D that's no longer in print. And I think all of these other people, they thought that might happen. I mean, there was a lot of concern before this year that maybe Wizards of the Coast was going to drop tabletop entirely. And the whole OGL fiasco, that was kind of intertwined with, because some people thought, hey, they're getting rid of the OGL so that they can lock things behind a paywall on the internet. And so maybe some of these people thought, hey, there's an opportunity to actually be the tabletop replacement for D&D. But absent that, I don't really know what differentiates any of these games. I've seen their product announcements and their descriptions, and each one has a one-liner or a two-liner that says a little bit how they're different, but they're all fundamentally, I would not include Shadowdark in this category, but the other ones, they're fundamentally pretty vanilla fantasy role-playing. I think Shadowdark, again, because trying to be a 5e replacement like I think a lot of the others were, Shadowdark, it's got neat things like the fact that no one can see in the dark, and you have this real world timer where an hour goes by and the GM says, okay, your torches went out. It kind of creates a bit of anxiety, horror, and some other things that I do think help differentiate it. The other ones, Tales of the Valiant, some of the others, I think unless they can differentiate themselves, they are going to be running behind Pathfinder, let alone not succeeding over D&D, unless some of the others manage to get a lot of attention because of their streaming connection.
And that goes to speak of say YouTubers that have leveraged their, I guess, fame in order to build out a game. One of them that comes to mind, just as you were talking about, is DC20 by the Dungeon Coach, $2.2 million raised on Kickstarter. And this is, I'll show you what the kind of bubble that I'm in. I was like, I've never heard of the Dungeon Coach. I'm not a 5e person, so I didn't. And then I was like, $2.2 million. Where did that come from? And once again, like you said, it's kind of like, it reminds me of the D20 days where how many fantasy games out of D20 could come, but $2.2 million is nothing to sneeze at. And but because of the presence of the YouTuber, I'm sure that obviously helped.
Yeah, I mean, we've got three in that category. DC20 is the newest one. That Kickstarter was just a couple of months ago. But the other two both announced themselves during the OGL fiasco, and one was Daggerheart, which is Matt Mercer, and the other is Draw Steel, which is Matt Colville. And they're both getting a lot of attention. If they shift over their various YouTube streams from D&D to their new games, which I assume is the intent, that could make them competitive. I mean, that's definitely a distinguishing characteristic. Hey, yeah, this is an FRPG that's kind of very similar to D&D, but it's the one that all of my favorite people online create these awesome campaigns about. So those are the ones that I think maybe could get out there.
And in particular, and I'm sure he'll never come on my show, so I don't mind offending him, is the one that really kind of struck me was the Matt Colville one, where they had nothing. It was nothing other than, obviously they've got a good record of making games or adventures and that kind of stuff, but they had no rule set. They kind of had this loose kind of idea of just support us, and they made $4.5 million. What they didn't even have a name at the time. It was just called the MCDM game.
Yeah.
That's shocking that people would support that.
I don't find it shocking. I mean, I certainly see how interested and excited people are of every new episode of Critical Role. Talking about the stories, or wanting to but not being afraid to because their other friend hasn't seen it yet, and there might be spoilers. Um, his slug line for his games was making adventure building and fighting monsters fun, and I think the adventure building kind of goes to what his brand is, making it easier for GMs, making it more fun for GMs. And so I can see the selling point there too. But certainly we have been seeing since, I'd say, about the D20 explosion, individual designers who really have the name recognition and can pull people in just because of that. And now it just happens that they are designers / YouTubers.
Well, I guess I'm getting old because somebody that's going to deliver in 3 years, I'll say just wait 2 more years before you kickstart. That's just me. But speaking of crowdfunding and kickstarting and backer kits and all that kind of stuff, backer kit kind of jumped into the fray. They had previously been more of a fulfillment option. I kind of looked at it like Netflix and Blockbuster, where like Netflix at one point was almost going under, and they approached Blockbuster and they were like, help us out here, and Blockbuster just laughed them out of the room. And I'm not saying that happened exactly, but BackerKit like was fulfilling a need that was obviously there for shipping fulfillment, and then Kickstarter just let them do it, and then BackerKit grew to the point where they're now competing with Kickstarter.
Yeah, I've been astounded by the poor business sense of Kickstarter to not put this back in fulfillment and to let BackerKit them create themselves as a competitor. It seems like, if someone wrote up what were the biggest business missteps of the last 10 years, that would certainly seem one of them within our scope / sphere. BackerKit, I see more and more companies who are exclusively putting their products through them. Why pay fees for both Kickstarter and BackerKit when you want to use them for the back end otherwise? BackerKit also does not yet have the support infrastructure that I think it needs within its website. I mean, every year when I write up my reports for the end of the year, I go to Kickstarter and I say, okay, what tabletop games made more than $1 million, and sort them for me, by order of when they were released. I can't do that on BackerKit, but it's not just, I can't do that sort of thing. It's hard to find, good listings of a lot of information, what other things people have made. A lot of it still feels very raw to me. And so I think there's going to be growing pains there. And I really hope they pick up some of that because they're clearly picking up Kickstarter's business. What really astounded me with BackerKit was I'd known they were growing. I'm continuing to write histories for Designers and Dragons. And as I go on, I have seen more and more companies who were doing Kickstarter up until a year or two ago, and their newest ones are all out on BackerKit. And I've been a patron for at least one BackerKit thing in the last year. Brandon Sanderson did a secret novel BackerKit for just one novel and some leather-bound books, and he raised $20 million or something like that, which may be BackerKit's top right now. Sanderson also has the top for Kickstarter, which is $45 million. So I've known it's been big. But what surprised me was when I looked up all of the big crowdfundings for this year, I now look for $1 million or more, and they were all on Kickstarter. Not a single one of them was on BackerKit. And I think when I looked, there's a handful of products on BackerKit ever, including that Brandon Sanderson, and kind of adjacent to us, a big Gloomhaven Kickstarter BackerKit from a few years ago. Yeah. But this year, none of the $1 million were on BackerKit. In fact, BackerKit has never done a $1 million pure role-playing. The Gloomhaven had role-playing as an aspect of it, but there was also a second edition of the board game, which I suspect brought in most of the money.
Well, it's interesting because I've used both on my kind of most recent Kickstarter, and I ended up having to use BackerKit because Kickstarter didn't have that kind of shipping aspect to it. But I see in their roadmap they're planning to add it, so it seems like they're trying to kind of catch up where they've fallen behind. But also BackerKit added a new feature, which was kind of like collaborative backer kits or like crowdfunding all under one umbrella. What Mothership had Mothership Month, which
Yes.
I think there's 10 adventures, and including the from actual Tuesday night games, and they came together to kind of like create that critical mass between all of them. So that's like a new innovative area. And I'm kind of curious, like how far things are going to go on BackerKit and versus Kickstarter.
Yeah, that Mothership Month was very exciting to see, and it really helped to bring up all of the ones not done by Tuesday night games, I suspect. So it's great that they're doing innovations, but they also need to do a little catch up. But the fact that they're willing to innovate, that's awesome, and it's clearly what's needed in the space, because to this point we've just had, Kickstarter and people who did basically the same thing.
And speaking still on the topic of Kickstarters and crowdfunding, licensed properties. You mentioned Brandon Sanderson earlier in Cosmere, which I didn't know anything about myself. So once again, maybe I'm getting old, but it seems like licensed properties and like developing games based upon those properties seems to be being pretty successful. Let's see, Cosmere made 15 million, Discworld by Modifius 3 million, Adventure Time, which everybody knows, the fun cartoon by Cryptozoic, 1.6 million. That's some big money.
Yeah, it seems like many of the biggest Kickstarters ever for role-playing games have been licensed. And I mean, some companies are solely working on that. Modifius, yes, they had the Adventure Time, but Star Trek's their biggest product right now. They had a very successful Conan line. Licensed games seem very big, and I think that speaks probably to the kind of expansion of the role-playing industry to a lot of new people that we've seen in the last 10, 20 years. Definitely the last 10 since 5e came out. I think a lot of those people are interested in role-playing, and they're more interested in trying it if, hey, it's this property that I love already.
And then there's obviously some other big successes, but they all seem to be 5e related, which maybe is no surprise. But
Yeah,
there's still like this undying thirst for these types of 5e products.
yeah. I said since COVID, we've been seeing every year half a dozen to a dozen Kickstarters for pure role-playing games that exceeded $1 million. And it seems like maybe a third of those have been 5e the whole time. And the thing that surprises me the most, you said Dungeon Coach, you had no idea who that was, which that was also my experience. I was writing a little bit about DC20, and I wrote, oh, successful Kickstarter. And then a while later, I went back and looked at more. I was like, oh, he's a YouTuber with a channel that's very successful. That's how he got. Similarly, all of these 5e games are coming out from companies that I've just barely heard of. They've just barely, crossed over. Like, there were 3 big ones this year: Archvillain Games, Hit Point Press, and Dungeon Dudes. I've never written about any of them. I know Hit Point Press and Dungeon Dudes only because they've had big Kickstarters in previous years that also exceeded the $1 million. I don't know who they are. I don't see them discussed on any of the boards I'm on. Clearly, they have big success, and I have to attribute that mostly to 5e.
And then getting away from 5e, I think that might be one of the last times we get to mention them, hopefully. Returns of some of the classics. Just talk to us, like, is it nostalgia? Is it just like new, like you just can't get the content anymore? And so what do you think?
Well, I've been writing yearly histories for more than a decade. I started when the first Designers and Dragons came out, maybe the second. And the whole time I've been saying classics have been doing well, classic reprints. This year seems to be one of the best ever. I felt like there were 3 returns from the 80s, all of which kickstarted, that were really impressive. One was the Ars Magica Definitive Edition from Atlas Games. I'm a big Ars Magica fan. It's where I got my start writing design work in the role-playing industry. And so they did this, big new edition of their current version of the game, new version of their current edition, and they raised $800,000 for it. Not quite the million mark, but that's for a relatively niche 1980s game. So DC Heroes just closed a couple of days ago as we're doing this conversation. I think it topped out just over 450,000, but I actually haven't looked at the final number. And then Chaosium did an ElfQuest classic based on the old Warp Graphics comic by the Pennies, Wendy and Richard Penny, and that one came out somewhere over 200,000. So very successful. In some cases, both the DC Heroes and the ElfQuest, I thought very impressive to get back in print, because you were just saying is part of the problem, that they're not accessible. And as much as we've just been talking about how great licensed games are, because they're probably bringing people into the hobby, because they're raising these amazing Kickstarters, they're helping companies just do amazing work at a level probably higher than we ever could have imagined in the industry. A license ends and the products become really inaccessible. And so the fact that 2 out of 3 of these classic ones that came back in, huge Kickstarters were licensed, that's great to see those in print again. It's great that Cryptozoic for DC Heroes, who was not the original publisher, and Chaosium for ElfQuest, who was the original publisher, managed to bring them back. Awesome. I think there's some nostalgia here, but in my opinion, at least, these are all pretty good games too. The DC Heroes, it was done at the same time that TSR was doing Marvel Heroes, and they were both kind of held up as great licenses, great adaptations of these superhero worlds. And the Ars Magica, I've always felt like it's just a phenomenal look at a very, very tiny niche of fantasy role-playing, which is Wizards. And it had some very innovative play. And of course, it was where Jonathan Tweed and Mark Reinhagen, who both went on to much bigger success, came in. And ElfQuest, it was by Steve Perrin, who also did RuneQuest. So it's kind of a great ancillary work for him.
And Pendragon 6e.
Yeah, Pendragon 6e. They did not have a Kickstarter for it. They just put it out. It's been, we've been hoping for it for a while. Greg Stafford was working on it, many years ago before his passing. And so it's really great to have kind of one of his final works out there, with huge amounts of design and development done by the people on the current team. Pendragon's another of my favorites, so I am eager to maybe do a new Pendragon game with this. Though there's still, we're waiting a little bit for a new GM's guide to kind of close out some of the other things. There's enough to play now, but actually creating adventures and stuff, I'd probably need to go back to my other things. So, and Chaosium has been doing gorgeous work for the last however many years it is since the new team took over in the 10s. And so the new Player's Guide, Grey Knight, which is their first adventure, they're both very, very pretty too.
And Castle, going back to Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, there's Castle Zagig by Troll Games.
Yeah. When Gary Gygax passed, all of his properties disappeared. They were licensed mostly out to Troll Games at the time, and they all got pulled off the market. And it pointed out to, I should say, all of his later work, because of course his early work was owned by TSR, and then a lot of it got scooped up in the GDW lawsuit by TSR and other stuff. But his work from the late 90s onward, he all still owned. It all disappeared after his passing. And we know a lot more about that now that there was a probate battle over wills, because there were apparently 2 different wills, one of which left things to his wife, and one of which left things to his wife, but under the understanding that it was going to pass to his kids. I think that was how it ended up. And so it's great that he was able to maintain ownership of that later stuff. But the fact that his passing caused it all to go out of print for 15 years really kind of showed the dangers of, what happens to these worlds that are loved and these games that are loved by so many people when someone passes. And Greg Stafford really is held up now as someone who really thoughtfully figured out how to maintain his games after his passing. And so he made sure that there was this new chaosium in place, that it was staffed by people who loved all of his works. He managed to get everything back under that umbrella. I'm not sure if the Pendragon came back to them before or after his passing. It was around the same time. And instead, Gary Gygax had these two different wills, and it caused 15 years of legal battles. One of the other things that just happened this year that was very important was that Traveler passed from Mark Miller, who is thankfully still with us, to Mongoose. And he said that he'd actually taken inspiration from what Greg Stafford had done, and he really wanted to make sure that there was a plan for how Traveler could continue when, hopefully many, many years in the future, he is not with us anymore. And so I feel like these two sides are really something that affects whether classic games will be around or not.
And then a bit of controversy. Blackmore Age of the Wolf purported to be the last work of Dave Arneson and disputed by his estate. I actually have an interview with Griff Morgan and Chris Graves from the Fellowship of the Thing where they talked about that. Any sense? I don't even know if there's a resolution to that yet, if at all.
I have not heard a resolution. Age of Wolf, as you said, it was purported to be Dave Arneson's last work. And I think Dave Arneson was working with the people who published it. And I think how much he contributed, if any, is in question. The estate very early on said this was not sanctioned. And then when it actually was put out at Gen Con, they questioned whether it was by him at all. And that was the last I heard. But it went out to people at Gen Con who were in specific events, and it was called a cash grab by the estate, and now it's available for free as a PDF download. And so anyone can grab it. Kind of cool having a new Blackmore book from Studio Inkbat, who which we could see because it was one of the foundational worlds. Whether it's Arneson or not, whether it should actually be published as a Blackmore book, I think those are pretty open questions.
And then coming into the end of some of these classics, Fighting Fantasy being brought back by Steve Jackson Games.
Yeah. Fighting Fantasy's had some anniversaries lately, and so there's been some new books out. There's been some new books out by the original creators, Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, different Steve Jackson. The UK Steve Jackson. And so that's been pretty cool. And they've kind of been on my list of, do I think I can find time to do a Fighting Fantasy book? Should I buy some of these British imports to get the newest stuff they've done? Because they look pretty fun and exciting as someone who was playing them a lot in the 80s. But Steve Jackson Games announced that next year they're going to start coming out with English copies. And so I won't have to import from the UK. I'm hoping that's going to make them a lot more available. They were really cool books. I hope that holds up in the modern day when people have computer games and other things that are much more sensationalistic, but it's great to have them coming back into print in the United States so we don't have to import them. And I have pushed off my tentative plans to start getting some British imports. I'm going to probably start just buying what Steve Jackson's putting out because I don't have any of my original books anymore.
I still think it's crazy that there was two Steve Jacksons that were as critical to the role-playing game world as they were. Yeah. And it took me, I don't know how old I was when I finally figured it out, but because I thought, boy, this Steve Jackson's pretty prolific. Well, both of them were, but I mean, like double that. And then I couldn't help but notice Harnworld. And this was one of those things that like I've seen pictures of it and I've seen like other things, and Columbia Games, they've been like the way back of Columbia Games has been around for like a long time, and they re-released Harnworld.
Oh, I'd missed that one. I'll have to take a look and add it to my list. Harnworld's definitely a great classic world. First appeared in the 80s. It's another one that got kind of messed up with the passing of the original creator, in that for a while, both Columbia and I think Celestia was the name of the other company, were putting out things and saying they were the only ones with rights to I don't know if any of that's cleared or not.
Oh, I guess I wait and see. That's the world that we live in. Okay, let's move on to the OSR and community content. OSR, my channel is kind of a little bit dedicated to indie games and OSR kind of specifically, but there was some like really in our little neck of the woods, pretty big successes. Dolmenwood, over $1 million on Kickstarter. The Karen 2E box set, 250K on Kickstarter. Knave 2E, 650K. That's Ben Milton. And then Zweihander Reforged, 166K. That's pretty decent in the indie game space.
Yeah. The growth and expansion of the OSR, particularly in the 20s, but in the late 10s also, has been amazing. One of the things I really love about the OSR as it is focused right now is the attention to graphic design. Old School Essentials, with all of its pages on all of its rules written out on double page spreads, Mothership with really careful attention, thanks to Sean McCoy's basis in graphic design. They've been creating things that don't just look great, that don't just really enhance the game and give you a feel of the genre, but also make it easier to play. And so that's been great to see as everything's been leveling up and they're coming out in really professional publications now. So I love where the OSR is. I am eagerly awaiting the delivery of my Dolmenwood books, because I definitely kickstarted them back when they were out. And the other big things that have been out this year, also including Mothership and Shadowdark, which Shadowdark was the very, very end of last year, and Mothership was June or something. It's been very exciting, and it's great to see where it's going to go from there, especially as an increasing number of these games are really trying to adapt old school gameplay and old school themes to more modern mechanics in many cases. Shadowdark very explicitly so. Old School Essentials and thus Dolmenwood, they're still very BX. I'm looking forward to that too. But it's really a great melting pot right now, and they're putting out so much good stuff. I mean, like you, the indie stuff and the OSR stuff, a lot of that's what interests me at least as much as anything mass market coming out.
And Mothership finally delivering. I couldn't help but maybe it was morbid of me. Once in a while, I would go to the comment section of the Mothership Kickstarter just to see how angry people were that it was taking as long as it was. But they finally delivered, and it seems like all things have been forgiven. Most people, at least, I think, have said, "Okay, you did good. I'm happy with it." But it took a long time for them to deliver. And I did an interview with Sean. I'll put the link up about this and just the dark days of that. But I was happy to finally see it come to fruition, because like out of morbid curiosity, I once in a while did go to the comment section just to see how bad it was getting.
Yeah, Tuesday Night Games has had problems with delivery more than once in their lifetime. Their very first Kickstarter was a movie about kickstarting a game, which I don't think's ever come out, unless I've missed it. And their second one was Two Rooms and a Boom, which was the game they were doing the movie about. And that one got delayed. I think it missed its deadline by a year or so, its delivery date. And in those early days, if you go back and look, Tuesday Night Games got kicked up one side of the road and down the other. I think the big difference between that and Mothership was when Mothership was being delayed, they knew what they were going for, and they knew that the people that are that angry and making those angry comments are a very, very small percentage of the people who Kickstarter. They're just the loud ones. I think also that in that 10-year span, the community's gotten a little more accepting that, yes, a lot of things fail their deadlines. And Sean McCoy had the best of all explanations for the delay, which is, he said, "I had a second kid. I never understood how much more trouble that was going to be." And he says that most people, when he says, "I had a second kid," they're like, "Oh, okay. I'm going to go delete my comments now. Sorry."
And one of the hallmarks of the OSR and the indie space is community. And Ennies actually added a new category talking about best community content, and that's changed.
Yeah, that used to be focused on convention games a while ago. And so the fact that it is now best community content as opposed to best organized play, which no one understood what meant anymore, that's amazing. I think if you want to talk about the impact and changes that Wizards of the Coast has made on the industry, the most underrated change is January 2016, when they came out with the DMs Guild, and suddenly anyone could not just officially put out D&D products that they would kind of give some attention to, but build in the Forgotten Realms. And not only has DMs Guild been very successful, but a dozen, probably more than a dozen, probably dozens of companies have taken up the same model and put out their own community content. And that has, fandom was really pretty big in the 80s, maybe into the 90s. It was focused on fanzines. There was a lot of content produced, content you can't really get anymore. And I think that with community content, I think that old surge, which had died out with the internet, has come back, I wouldn't say tenfold, but much, much bigger than it was in the days of fanzines. And they're producing awesome content. I have a full row of a shelf over there of stuff from the Johnstown Compendium, which is Chaosium's RuneQuest community content. And so much of it is such high quality. One of the best RuneQuest adventures I've ever read was community content.
And that goes way back to almost like, the original zines and the APAs that have been made famous by Lee Gold, Allurums and Excursions, which I've also done an interview with Lee, and I was super happy. We always, and we'll talk about it later, we always do an in memoriam for people that we've lost. And I had this like spike in my interview with Lee Gold. And I was like, oh my God, did Lee pass? That's what it was my first thought. And I was very relieved to find out that she's doing fine. But I think Matt Colville actually mentioned her in one of his videos. And that just goes to show you the extent of what, Matt says one word about that, and then people are searching for it. And I think mine's maybe one of the only video interviews with Lee that there is. And so all of a sudden I got this spike. But Matt should have put a link to my video. That's what he should have done. But anyways, community content, and it's like long-standing that people love to create in the spaces that they play in. And with that said, broader context, we're living in interesting times. Let's talk about some of the things that are shaping the gaming world and creators and players and that kind of thing.
Sure. We certainly saw that the role-playing community got involved with the election. And a lot of that, I think, very positively was through Mike Selinker's Gamers for Harris, which saw 1,100 designers, creators, writers, including me, sign off on a statement of why we thought Harris was the best option for the White House. And I think we're going to be very, very sad that we said no, because I would not be shocked if the price of role-playing games and board games doubles next year. It's all going to be dependent upon whether the tariffs that Donald Trump has claimed he's going to bring in actually happen or not. But he's claimed he's going to put 100% tariffs on China. And he started a trade war with China last time he was in office, which is still having repercussions now. So if you're playing a board game, if you're playing a role-playing game, it was probably printed in China. And if you have 100% tariffs, those are all going to be borne by the importers, which means ultimately they're all going to be borne by you. And so I'm really hoping that he's just trying to hardball, that he is just trying to use it as a negotiating tactic. But if not, the fact that Gamers for Harris did not convince people to vote for Harris, wider issues, of course, means we could easily see the price of all of these games that we love double and put them out of reach of many of us. So that was definitely one of the biggest things. And the other big thing, of course, was the war in Palestine. It seems to be almost like nothing else in the modern day to generate a lot of antipathy, no matter how someone falls on it. And so there was ruckus at Gen Con related to the Crit Awards. There was ruckus at Big Bag Con related to their request to have the statement from the river to the sea, which is generally seen as calling for the destruction of the Israel state. And there was ruckus at one of the conventions in Germany related to the Spiel des Jahres, which was very much the same thing. One of the winners of the Spiel des Jahres Kinderspiel, the award for more serious games, was wearing a pineapple in the shape of what's called Greater Palestine, which again calls for the destruction of the Israel state. And all of those caused huge amounts of controversy, huge amounts of anger. There were calls for boycotts of at least Big Bad Con, maybe Gen Con too. And there's horrible things going out there. And what's happening in Palestine, I believe, are war crimes, but it's also had an unnatural impact on a lot of these role-playing things. I think it's also important for us to talk about politics and to consider that as part of, the world we live in.
Well, it's as I said, difficult, interesting. They always, what's the proverb? Shall you live in interesting times? And it certainly is that. But let's take a break from that and just talk about what you're working on next. You already mentioned Free Trader Beowulf, the history of Traveler. And so once again, links are going to be in the show notes in the description so that you can purchase it for yourself. What else is in the queue for you?
Well, the two big projects that I've been working on since I started working about half-time on my role-playing history are what I currently call Designers and Dragons, The Lost Histories, and Designers and Dragons Origins. So Designers and Dragons, The Lost Histories is laid out right now as 3 books of new content for Designers and Dragons. 2 books literally are lost histories, though I guess they weren't lost, just not written, so semi-literally. Cover the 70s, 80s, 90s, 100s, companies that I just didn't write about at the time, probably because they were smaller, are less well documented for a lot of the stuff from the 70s and 80s, and for the odd odds because they were stuff that maybe was smaller, but just as often it was someone where it wasn't as obvious to me that they were really breaking out and going to be notable. The OSR, for example, got started right at the end of the odd odds with Osric and Labyrinth Lords and Swords and Wizardry, 2007, 8, 9. And so writing just a few years later, it was a little hard to see how much that was all going to explode. But also, like back in the 70s, I have new articles on some of the miniatures companies like Martian Metals, but also Grenadier and I think Ralpartha are both in there. I have articles on some accessory companies like the Armory, which was pretty big in the 80s. And also, of course, lots of classic companies that I just didn't cover the first time around. There was, for example, a whole set of companies out in the Washington, D.C. area. Little Soldier Games was one of them, but there were a few others that are less well known. So those books I've to date, third book of the series is The Tens, which has been the most requested book since we put out the Evil Hat set. So altogether, those 3 books, I've written about 350,000 words so far. I've written 69 histories. I counted them up this morning. And not quite done. I want to write 1 or 2 more for the first couple of volumes of the Lost Histories, and maybe 3 or more, 4 more for the 10s. And then I want to put a cap on them. And then because I've been working on them for 5 years, I need to go back and update all of the oldest ones and even some of the new ones, because inevitably I seem to finish writing a history and a major historical event seems to happen for the company 2 to 3 days later.
And so in the 10s, I think we've talked about this before. It's kind of nice to let things settle, like you said, because
Mm-hmm.
the future does change the view of the past. How often, going even back to like the re-examination of Gary Gygax and that kind of thing, how much time do you feel needs to be in place before you actually do a true history?
Well, true history, I'd love it if I could have 10, 20, 30 years on it. When I had 5 years or so, which I think is what I had on the the odd odds when I did the second edition for Evil Hat, it wasn't enough. It might have been a little less than 5 years to get my first edition in. There were things like the OSR that I missed just because they'd just been growing up. I mean, technically, the odd odds should include any companies that started publication as soon as December 31st, 2009. And so you got to have a little bit of time for that, or all you can write is, hey, they came out with a first book here. 5 years kind of seems like a bare minimum to me. There seems to be enough interest that seems to be about the right amount. I actually did start writing these tens histories in 2020, so I didn't have much time there, but I knew they were going to take years and years to do because I had so many other things I was doing. And so we're approaching the 5th year now. I'm relatively comfortable with them now, though. My last couple of histories that I have are Helmgest, which is a Swedish company, Renegade, who's doing World of Darkness stuff now, and Tuesday Night Games, which is my one that I am just finishing up to share with some of my patrons who are seeing my early work. Probably going to send it this afternoon. They all started publishing role-playing content in 2018. So that's still pretty near on, but at least, we have enough to talk about. I don't know quite when I'm going to be able to put a final cap on this, because Evil Hat and I are also now talking about, hey, we really need to get the previous books back into print. And if we do, I need to update them. So might be a couple more years which will really give them the fullness to be able to talk about the decade fully. And now there's increasingly companies where I look and I say, wow, that's an amazing new company. Are they only printing in the 2020s? And so I can't talk about them yet. Fortunately, people like Tuesday Night Games and the Arcane Library, which is Kelsey Dion's Shadow Dark publisher, they fortunately did start publishing things in the 10s before their big hits, which were really in the 20s. So I've been able to talk about them at least.
And I should also mention, and I will put a link to it as well, you do have a really good Patreon. You get monthly content and updates based upon all the work that you're doing. So I will have a link in below. And I am a subscriber, and you should be too. So check it out on Patreon.
Yeah, the Patreon has been great. I mean, it's nice to be able to get some funding, which I primarily use to buy source materials so that I can continue the work without feeling like I'm just spending money on a hobby or something. But it also keeps me going on a monthly basis. So every month I've tried to make sure that I put out at least one history. And so I've done 69 over just less than 5 years. So it's been a little more than that. And also I try and put out one thing on another project I'm doing. So I should mention the other thing that was the set of books I sent. That's Designers and Dragons Origins. Way back when I was just finishing up the second draft of Evil Hat's version of Designers and Dragons, I got mail from some of the people at what was then D&D Classics. It actually wasn't anything yet because it wasn't out. And they said, hey, we need to get you under an NDA. And once they did, they said, hey, we're going to start putting out all of the old D&D stuff on PDF again, because it had been off the market a couple of years by that time, allegedly because of concerns about piracy from Wizards of the Coast, though we were never really sure if that was the full story or not. And I said, this may be familiar, I don't have any time. I'm working a full-time job. I have these books that are in editorial right now. That's a 4-book series that I want to publish. You say you want things this month because you're coming out. There's no way. So yeah, send me a contract and we'll get it done. So as part of those contract negotiations, so what they asked me to write was a product history for each of their books that were coming out. So, they published 2 of ours, and I wrote I think it was specified at 250 to 500 words or something. On Tomb of Horrors, I often wrote much longer than that. About, what was its history. And Kevin Culp was another person who was also doing things. We kind of divided it up. I did the OD&D and the 1E and the basic D&D stuff, and he did the 3E stuff, and we drew the line kind of down the middle of 2E based on different product lines. And so when I wrote those for DriveThruRPG and Wizard of the Coast, primarily DriveThruRPG, I made sure on my contract that I kept ownership of it. That's kind of one of my thin red lines for history writing. If someone wants to do history writing, I'm thrilled to do so, but I maintain ownership of it so that if I later adapt it for Designers and Dragons or something, I don't have any concerns. And so one of the helpful things about empowering your creators to actually own what they create is it encourages them to create. And so we started this when DriveThruRPG went live with DM's Guild, and I had to produce something like 40 histories over the course of a month while I was working on the Designers and Dragons editorial. Then we had an ongoing they came out with 5 or 6 products a month, and Kevin wrote histories for half of them, and I wrote histories for half of them. And so that means every week, I had 2 to 3 histories to research and write. And Kevin dropped off because he had other products that he was working on. And I kept at it for, I think, 4 or 5 years. And the reason was I owned it. And so I knew, yes, this is a immense amount of work right now on top of the other stuff. But when I'm done, I will have, it turned out to be, about 1 million words of content that I can repurpose. And so when I started doing my own historical work again, right after we moved out here, I started looking, how can I arrange these into books? And I came up with a plan of, this will be a nice 4-book set. And I ended up putting together a 4-book set, which is at Evil Hat now, and we're calling Designers and Dragons Origins, that turned out to be just the histories on OD&D, AD&D First Edition, and Basic D&D. So that's been my other major project. I did about a book a year. For each book, I took my old product histories, I put them all into a standard format, and then I looked and I saw what were the inadequacies in the original write-ups, because I'd been forced to put them together in a week. And so ones where I'd done a full history reporting, some of those just went straight in. They were mostly from the last year or two I did, where we slowed down a little bit, and also where I'd really developed a more of a technique for getting the content and putting it down. And I expanded the ones where I had not written a lot about them before. And so about a book a year, I put together those first 4 books. They are so much expanded from what is on DriveThruRPG that if you looked at them, you could see they were the same content. But if you read them, you probably would not remember them as the same content. Those 4 books all went off to Evil Hat in April, May, somewhere like that. They have slowly been going through editorial since. I've gone back corrections on 2 books, and I've kicked back those corrections. The 3rd book should come to me right around the end of the year. And so we'll probably have the 4 books ready to go content-wise by spring sometime. And so it may be a Kickstarter next year. It may be a Kickstarter the year after, because the problem is Evil Hat has a very dense schedule for their Kickstarters. But basically, it will be the product that if something else falls through can go in, and otherwise it'll be on their schedule for whatever the end is once they get it through editorial and layout, because one of their rules is a book is done before we kickstart it. So,
which is a good rule. Tuesday night games. Are they going to do the same covers, or like completely revamp that too?
I suspect for the 10s we'll match that branding. For the Lost Histories, it is less clear, but it's less clear how we're going to put all of those together at this point. I assume for the product histories, we're going to figure something else out. But Fred Hicks at Evil Hat is an amazing art director. I love those book covers that he did for the original Designers and Dragons. I am very certain that whatever he does is going to be awesome.
Cool. Well, we all look forward to seeing it come to fruition, and once again, great work on all of those books. It's a foundational piece if anybody wants to know the history of role-playing games. Okay, predictions for the upcoming year. I know you don't like predictions, but I'm going to put you on the spot here. Do you have any thoughts on how things are going to go?
I am deeply concerned with what tariffs might do to the industry. I think we could see a widespread depression if they go through as they can, and I think they'll have a horrific effect on the industry if they go through. Because, like I said, I could easily see prices doubling. So a lot of the prediction is going to be, does that happen or not? If tariffs go through, we're going to see a lot fewer companies. We're going to see a lot of companies going out of business. We're going to see a lot fewer books, and we're going to see people unable to pay for games. If the tariffs don't go through, we'll probably see more of the same as we have, which is pretty successful, happy role-playing industry. I think we are going to see Wizards of the Coast do some really stupid things, and I think we're going to see them pull deeper into their digital cave. I think they're going to keep coming out with the tabletop games, though. The rest of the industry, we see some big companies. Modiphius is certainly one of them. Chaosium might be back there, who are continually doing pretty strong stuff, and I think we're going to see more of that. So I wouldn't expect a big change in the trends to date, except if the tariffs happen. I think AI is going to be continue to be a real point of contention. I am very hopeful we do not see a major publisher say we're going to go ahead and use AI, but I think there's some concern there.
Okay, and as we always end off the year in review, we talk about those that we've lost, creators that have brought their talents to us and like shaped the industry. So let's maybe just go through some of them. J.H. Brennan.
Yeah, J.H. Brennan was someone who I encountered through his game books. He did a series of books called Grail Quest, which were about a young squire probably living in Arthurian England named Pip, and they were a lot of fun, and they really gave a feeling of the Arthurian mythos. I love the Arthurian mythos. It's why Pendragon is a favorite game, not the opposite. And that might well have been come to me because of those Grail Quest books. And with his passing, I was like, oh, I got to find copies of those again. But in the more direct role-playing industry, he came out with two pretty groundbreaking games that I don't know if they were pivotal or inspirational or not. And one of them was Man, Myth, and Magic, and the other was Time Ship. And they were both put out by Yaquinto, who probably most people don't know now, but they were a small role-playing publisher in the 80s who actually may be better known for coming out with these album games, which were war games that came like an old record album and you could open them up. But
that sounds cool.
Yeah, it was a neat little innovation for wargaming. There's so many neat little innovations like that you find in history. But Man, Myth, and Magic was initially set in Roman times, Celtic. I forget which. I think it was Celtic. And then there was another series of books that were in historic Egypt. And so they were some of the earliest historic role-playing games. And the idea was maybe you were reincarnated through these different time periods, which was kind of a neat way to tie together these kind of disparate areas. And Time Ship was one of the first time travel games. There were a lot that came out right in the 80s there. And so they were kind of neat innovations at the time. But like I said, they were groundbreaking. I'm not sure if they were influential, but his Grail Quest books, I feel like, were more so. And he was a spiritualist. He wrote some books on occultism. He was a writer who did like 100 books or something. And so having that different point of view in the early industry, I think was pretty cool too. So.
And Janelle Jaquays. That's a big one.
Janelle Jaquays. She did such great work for in the earliest days of the industry. Caverns of Thracia, Dark Tower is the one that always catches me, because it was just this amazing dungeon design where you have these 2 towers and then you have interconnections between them in other levels. Her designs have since been described as nonlinear dungeons, meaning that you don't have to necessarily go in and follow a specific path in. There may be different entrances, different exits, different ways to move between levels. They're kind of what a lot of people find, I think, very exciting in the mega dungeons of the early industry, like Castle Greyhawk and Castle Blackmore, that we've never really seen in their original form, but we have seen variations like Zagig, which we talked about since. And she was the one that really brought that into print for the industry through her work at Judges Guild. And late in her life, she was redoing her work on some of her other products about character creations and stuff, central casting. And it is very sad that she was unable to finish that. She was struck down very, very surprisingly. And so hopefully some of that will still come out. And thankfully, she is well remembered for the work she did. And she could really see a lot of the love that there was for her when she was able to kind of reconnect with the industry more in her final years.
And there was, I guess, sadly, a little bit of controversy. Like people referred to that dungeon design as jaquazing the dungeon. And then Justin Alexander from the Alexandrian blog coined the term in his book, Xandering the dungeon. And a lot of people took offense to that. I think he's issued somewhat of an apology and like misunderstanding type of thing, but kind of tainted the whole jaquazing the dungeon.
Yeah, it did. And, from what I understand, the issue was probably a legal one, that maybe his publishers did not like the using the name of someone else in there who hadn't necessarily given the rights. Not that that's actually intellectual property rights. So I would certainly give him the benefit, all the benefit of the doubt. And he was not just trying to, put his name up there instead of Janelle's. But yes, there was the controversy.
But, at the end of the day, there's also a memorial jam in her honor. So the community kind of rallied behind that. And so the memory of Janelle carries on.
And I think one of the really lucky things was that a lot of her work came out in some really awesome volumes from Goodman Games. I think actually the final big one, Judges Guild Collected Volume 2 or whatever it was exactly, I think that actually came out just after she passed. But Judges Guild came under controversy in the last decade because the inheritors of the original Judges Guild don't seem like the greatest people. And so the fact that Goodman Games went out of their way to get Janelle's major works over to them so that they can continue publishing them and they will stay in print and accessible, whereas the Ghost of Judges Guild has totally been given up. That's great, and we're really fortunate for that, so that we have continued access to her work, including a new classics volume of Dark Tower, which I think is out.
And another person we lost, James M. Ward.
Yeah. James Ward was such an important person in the early industry. I mean, he put out Metamorphosis Alpha before he ever worked at TSR, which was the first science fiction game or science fantasy game, depending on how you call it. First are always difficult, but definitely groundbreaking. It in many ways became Gamma World, and I think you also have to say that those two are very influential. He did the original Deities, Demigods, and Heroes for OD&D, and then he did Deities and Demigods without the heroes, apparently, for AD&D. That work being with Rob Kuntz. And so he did all of this really great influential work on the early industry. He was working at TSR by the time Deities and Demigods came out. And then he got laid off because TSR was really busy laying people off in the 80s due to, from what we now understand, pretty bad business management. But he was considered so critical, and he was doing freelance work that was so expensive that they said we should just bring him back in so we can pay him less than for all of that. And so he ended up being the leader of TSR's design during the late 80s and 90s when AD&D second edition was done. And so, you know, Steve Winter, Zeb Cook, they get the main credit for 2E because they were the editor and the designer for it. But this all was under Ward's purview, oversight when he was overseeing things. And so I think you have to say how critical he was, not just for that early influential work, but also at TSR all the way up to almost the day it went out of business, at which point, you know, I think it was him who said, I am not going to, you know, lay off these people you're telling me to lay off.
And he left at that point because he refused to lay them off. Yeah. James Carpio.
Yeah. James Carpio, I don't know as well as some of the others, probably because he's more modern. He was working at Solarian, not just working, he was, you know, one of the principals there, which was TSR Games, the second TSR Games, i.e. after the real TSR and before the Idiots took over the name more recently. He did Top Secret New World Ardor with them and with Merle Rasmussen, who did the original Top Secret.
Amber Cook.
Yeah, Amber Cook, another one more modern, so I know less about her, but I know she was influential and important at Roll20 and also for the kind of rebuilt free RPG day that got bought out and passed on in the last several years.
And finally, James Wade.
Yeah, James Wade. He was someone who actually I saw Mike Selinker talking about him. And Mike Selinker, of course, had a history in the RPGA, and that's where James Wade did his work. And so he's one of these people that even in my own Designers and Dragons, he doesn't show up as much because the organized play is kind of outside of the company-focused orientation I have. But he did a lot of work with the RPGA, and he did some live games called Live/Wire, which I don't know as much about. But
well,
yeah, there's people in the RPGA just as influential as the actual designers for everything they brought into the industry through conventions.
And if there's those that we've missed, you know, please let us know. It's a big industry, and sometimes we might not be able to capture them all. But with that said, Shannon, thank you for joining me once again. I really look forward to these year in reviews, and I always enjoy your insight and your wisdom on how you approach like the context of a year and the broader scope of the industry. And as we say goodbye, we'll do a play out of the memoriam of those that we've lost. But I just want to say I really do appreciate all the work that you've done in providing context for the history of the game.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate being invited, and these are one of the things I look forward to too. So hope the audience does also.
Okay, well, we'll see you next year.
Definitely.
And once again, we'll now play those that we've lost over this last year.